Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Traditionally, wars were fought with troops, planes, tanks, missiles, and a whole lot of money. Today, warfare is very different. Now it's about financial flows, sanctions, and proxy wars. Is Washington making one hard push to eliminate its adversaries? To CrossTalk, what I call the beginning of World War III, I'm joined by my guest, Rodney Shakespeare in London. He is a political and economic Democrat and co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. In Phoenix, Arizona, we have Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist, writer, and founder of the news website 21stCenturyWire.com. And in New York, we cross to George Samueli. He is a fellow of the Global Policy Institute of London Metropolitan University and author of the new book, Bombs for Peace. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. George, if I go to you in New York, we have the declared war that's not really a war against ISIS. We have a protest movement that has a lot of Western money in Hong Kong, and we still have Ukraine hemorrhaging. Not a coincidence in my mind that these are all America's enemies. You know, you have Iran, you have Syria, you have China, and you have Russia. And it's all happening simultaneously. Coincidence?
No, I don't think so. I think this really does go back to that memo written by Paul Wolfowitz back in 1991 when he was in the George H.W. Bush administration, that U.S. policy should be to prevent any rival power to emerge on any continent in the world. And I think this has been characterized U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. I think that what has changed in the last few years has been the emergence of Russia, because I think Russia provides the focus for opposition to American global hegemony. And that is why Russia is the target of the U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that's why the crisis in Ukraine happens, and that's why I think the present crisis will get worse, because I don't think America is going to just allow Russia to get ever stronger and to build a coalition of powers opposing U.S. hegemony. And so I think that things could get a lot more dangerous. I don't think that the Ukraine crisis is anything close to being over. And I think that the American global expansion of NATO will continue, because the aim is to eliminate Russia, because without Russia, there isn't really any serious world opposition to American hegemony.
Okay, well, Rodney, I think if that's the idea, and I do remember the memo, it's gravely mistaken. The country that I'm living in right now isn't going to go disappear or whatnot. But Rodney, it does seem to me that Washington is stirring up more and more trouble here. Now it's against the Chinese in Hong Kong, and the way Western media has turned them into little darlings and all of this. I believe in grassroots democracy, yes, obviously, but I don't believe in outside funding of hundreds of thousands of dollars to get people, to sway people to go in the direction that the outside power wants.
The big elephant in the room, which is about to keel over and crush us all, is the overall global economy. If you compare it with just 2007 and 2008, debt is in fact more than then. The derivatives position at roughly 700 trillion, 10 times the global economy, has been going up. Rich-poor division has increased. The US dollar is a complete falsification. And real middle-class incomes in country after country have been going backwards. And it only needs a precipitating event and that economy collapses. And when all fails economically, they go to war. And they go to war to blame somebody, let's blame Russia, and they go to war in order to control and regiment their own populations, and they go to war to eliminate people like the speakers on this program. And that situation is there, and it is going on, and that is what is underlying this increasing move to war, which you and the previous colleague have correctly identified. But what lies behind is the increasing certainty of collapse. And as for the precipitating events, it could be Ebola, it could be the Swiss referendum on repatriating their gold from the USA, where they'll find out that there isn't any of their gold left in Fort Knox.
It's true.
Any of these can be the precipitating event.
All right, let's look at some of the other events here. Patrick, you know, I've been watching, you know, these interventions here and in this exporting of quote-unquote democracy from the United States for quite a few years right now, and I get this impression that Washington is just in a rush. It's in a hurry. It needs to do things fast. You know, Ukraine a year ago, as I'm speaking right now, was very, very quiet. And then it went through a horrific political upheaval, a civil war, thousands of people killed. And there was nothing really wrong in the first place. And now we have, oh, my goodness, ISIS has joined the party. Oh, and now we have this movement in Hong Kong. And all of this money churning around, you know, making sure trouble is being made. And it's all coming from, well, the United States.
Yeah, you know, it's quite an extraordinary world we live in the 21st century. You know, in the 20th century, we had emerging ideologies. We had capitalism, we had communism, we had fascism, all the various isms. And the 21st century, we're in an epoch which is essentially a post-ideological epoch. It's a post-rational era. And it's basically Western politicians are groping in the dark, basically, devoid of any kind of ideologies. But what is really pushing it is this kind of hyper-economic motive. And we have, obviously, the energy plays, which we have throughout the Middle East and globally as well, including the Ukraine and Russia. But that seems to be the corporate plays. The economic motives are the real drivers now. And it's being kind of window dressed with this kind of, you know, attempt to create some sort of ideological facade to justify whatever actions are taking place, or humanitarian interventions, or kinetic actions, or, you know, Twitter revolutions. So that's the world we live in. It's post-rational, Peter. It's post-ideological, and it's chaotic. And there's plenty of think tanks in Washington that are egging on their politicians to give it a try to manage this chaos.
Yeah, give it a try.
That's where we're at right now.
That's what it is. You know, let's just throw the dice and see what happens. That's what it was in Ukraine. That's what it's all been about in Syria. Maybe that's going to be the case in Hong Kong. George, if I can go to you, you were talking about, you know, no power being able to stand up to the United States. But one of the interesting things that's happened is that China and Russia have become much closer than I thought it would be. But because of the crisis in Ukraine, invented crisis, I need to stress, in Ukraine, Russia and China have come together. This infuriates Washington. And now you have Iran being able to call a lot of shots in the region with ISIS in Syria. This is infuriating Washington. That's why they need to push harder and harder and spend more and more money on defense.
Yes, absolutely right. And really, the leader of this has been Russia. And I think that it started when Putin came to power. And when he first made the point that we really don't need a unipolar world, we need a multipolar world. And this has really, you know, driven Washington crazy, because at least during the early years, okay, Russia wasn't taken seriously, but now, you know, Russia is a very serious economic and military power, and it's building up this coalition of powers. I mean, we have the BRICS, we have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we have the Eurasian Union. Russia is building up a coalition of powers, and it's obviously it's beginning to challenge the Western economic hegemony by its creating alternative financial institutions.
But George, let me jump in here, George. Let me jump in real quick here, George, because sure. I thought Russia was isolated. That's what I read in Western media.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. The international community is all up in arms against Russia. That's absolutely right.
Okay.
That international community being United States and Britain. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Or NATO. Or NATO. Just in NATO in general. That's the international community.
Right.
Go ahead, Rodney, jump in. Because
that's the international community.
This is the paradigm that we get in Western audiences are always told that. It's very interesting, the international community. Well, it's not just North America and its friends around the world. But this is something that people are constantly told in Western media. And I still want to stress this. It looks like this urgency that the West, particularly Washington, doesn't want to see China and Russia get together, and Iran get closer together. They're afraid of this. They need to act quickly. Go ahead, Rodney.
Yes, indeed. The shift is happening economically, politically and morally. Peter, if I could just touch on two circumstances which may speed this process up and at the same time will diminish this so-called community of nations. One of them will be the revelation that Russia did not shoot down their aeroplane MH17, that it was shot down by two Ju-15 fighter planes coming from Kiev. And the other one is that increasingly there is recognition now is that the truth about 9/11. And when those two really break out, the USA and the UK are going to go violent, and their support will immediately diminish, and they may well go to war to hide the fact that they've been exposed as what they are, a bunch of frauds, presiding over a collapsing economic system, having lost moral authority. And I don't quite agree that it's a post-ideology period. We're in a period in which there's one ideology thinks it is supreme and is trying to inflict itself on everybody else and doesn't realise that its time is over. Okay,
Patrick, let me go to Arizona here. I mean, let's talk about the kind of the moral bankruptcy of all of this, because, you know, we have a drone and a president that uses drones and doesn't have any other foreign policy. When I'm thinking like dealing with ISIS.
Yeah, there's a lot of micromanagement policy. There's a lot of things pretending to be policy. But essentially, right now, today, we look at the world, we look at the international community, as you referred to it earlier, and we look at the United Nations. The United Nations meant to be the kind of binding security body to keep major conflagrations from breaking out. And essentially, the United States and Britain and Israel, I'm going to throw Israel in there because they kind of exist outside of the UN community only when they.
Let me jump in here. I'll let you finish your point but we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on what I call the beginning of the Third World War. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Patrick, because Patrick, you were really mentioning some really interesting things here. Is because, you know, we look at we keep hearing from Samantha Power, the U.S. representative at the United Nations, saying it's dysfunctional, it doesn't work, and all that. Well, actually, it does work. The Security Council was to make sure one power wouldn't be dominant, and the Americans again blow a fuse because they don't get their way. And at the same time, you have an American president that just, you know, of constitutional law, and he just brushes law aside. I mean, here's a man that doesn't have any rules, any checks on him, a White House that does anything it wants with impunity. It talks about Russia violating the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, what is the United States doing to Iraq, doing to Syria, doing to Yemen, going to Somalia? I could go on and on and on. The hypocrisy of it all. That's an age that we live in.
Yes, and the damage that's been done over, you know, the last few decades is tremendous. You know, the United States, with Britain in the background, and obviously, again, I would say Israel I'll put in here because Israel acts with impunity when it comes to its own interests, like the United States, but doesn't participate, let's say, in the UN community. They've done to the UN, especially the United States, what Germany did to the League of Nations before the Second World War. There can be no doubt about this scenario whatsoever. And what's that done? It's basically it's turned the UN into the League of Nations. Mm-hmm. You're right, the UN does work. The Security Council does achieve some balance to keep major wars from breaking out, but only if those countries participate and have a dialogue together, which is not happening. The U.S. National interests seem to be its corporate interests or its politicized interests. And, you know, here's the other big danger is if the death of the American idea And when America can project all the military power at once around the world, but as soon as it is unable to project the idea that America is an honest broker in the international world, then America loses its power. And that's then we have a very huge breakdown of the sort of current order, and chaos ensues, and then a new order would emerge from that, and that's where things get a little bit murky. You know,
George, it's very interesting because the only diplomacy the West has now is just force. It's just gotten down to brute force. You know, it's all under the rubric, something must be done, okay, and let's bomb it because you can bomb extremism. I mean, what's happened? This is, we're degenerating into idiots when it comes to foreign policy and policy formulation in general. I'm serious here. I mean, we're being told black is white and white's black, and it just doesn't, and it certainly doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's no accident that this is happening, because of course that is the United States' big calling card. It is the overwhelming military power in the world, and NATO is just simply an offshoot of the United States, and that's what the United States has to offer, which is overwhelming military power. So how does it respond to any crisis? It uses military force, because of course if you use force and you bomb, you do create chaos, and you destroy states, you destroy lives, and then nothing is possible. No government is possible, no diplomacy is possible, no reconciliation, nothing is possible. And that's why the United States' first resort is always to force, because that's where it gets to call the shots. And that's why, you know, whether it's in Syria or it's in Libya, and of course the same thing in Ukraine. I mean, it's right now sending arms to Ukraine, it's sending trainers to Ukraine, and you know, I'm pretty sure that come next spring, Kiev will relaunch its offensive against Novorossiya, and again, America will be calling the shots, and Americans will be screaming that it's somebody else who's doing the intervening, somebody else is using the force, and it's America that's actually the upholder of international law.
Rodney, it's just, George really heads it there, because, you know, when I look at, you know, Geneva is a place where a lot of people like to have negotiations. You know, we had it with Ukraine, we had it with Syria, and it's always the West that breaks down and says, I don't have a partner to talk to. But indeed they do. But they don't want negotiations. They want to be able to call the shots and get the outcome that they want. They want it with their people that they're trained in Langley in the United States. They can be parachuted in. It's every single country they do this to. And because they want to be able to say they determined the outcome, which of course is extremely undemocratic. You know, how many democratic governments has the United States and its allies overthrown since the Second World War? I could do multiple programs on that topic alone. Go ahead, Rodney.
Peter, reference was made to Israel, and I would remind you that only, 2 or 3 days ago, that great thug Netanyahu of Israel was actually saying that there was something worse than ISIL in the world, yes. And that would be yes. The relationship with Iran. In other words, saying that they're going to attack Iran. If ever there could be a cause for a third world war, it would be Israel attacking Iran. So I think that one has to be put into the melting pot. And Israel is totally out of control, and it's the sort of wild card that could easily set off a real third world war.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And you know, Patrick, but I don't think that Israel would do that, because it will get the United States to do it, and the American taxpayer will have to pay for it. That's how it works.
Well, they are saying.
No, let me go to Patrick here. Let me go to Patrick.
Yes, via the USA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Peter. That you know, Israel will probably light the spark, but the United States would be dropping the bombs. But you know what's interesting, Peter, and you won't get this from an American-centric perspective, but the Israeli-Palestine issue and the binding relationship that the U.S. has with Israel, its quote-unquote greatest ally in the Middle East. This doesn't mean anything to people in Asia. You know, the Chinese, the Japanese, they don't resonate with this issue at all. To them, this represents an old world, or the West's old reach eastward. That's what the Israel issue represents to them. So there's a total disconnect with yes. the emerging world, or we'll call it the new world, which is really Asia and Eurasia. Yes. And so the narrative is completely contained and compartmentalized in the West. Going around, we've been chasing our tail with regards to the Middle East. With the Middle East is basically a Treaty of Versailles map-making exercise, yeah. Which we're now looking at. It's in the process of disintegrating.
Yes.
And yes, there's a definite interest here with Asia, China, and India with regards to how this is going to turn out. But in terms of the kind of religious or ideological things that the hangovers from the 20th century, there's no connection whatsoever with Asia. They have zero interest in this. Their interests are shaping a new BRICS-oriented or a kind of post-modernization of Asia in the 21st century.
You know, it's a very good point that Patrick brings up here. George, if I can go to you, we had Robert Fisk, the great journalist, on the program recently, and he said something that I think about quite often. He says, you know, when you look at the Middle East, and I'm just going to broaden out what Patrick says, but, you know, outside of the Western world, it demands the entire world know their dates, know their history. But, you know, we don't know, the Western world hardly knows anything about their history and their dates. And this is one of the big disconnects here. And this is why, again, the United States prefers to use force because, geez, you might have to think a little bit. You might have to learn something.
Yes, exactly. Because, of course, force is just is the easiest thing to do. So that's the first thing you resort to. And force, of course, has an immediate effect. I mean, it creates chaos. I mean, they use force in Iraq. And what has happened, I mean, the country is broken apart. They're all essentially at each other's throats. The same thing has happened in Syria. I mean, they started arming and training the anti-Assad forces. Lo and behold, we've got ISIS. Now they're doing some bombing of Syria. Of course, the Americans know perfectly well that they're not going to destroy ISIS by bombing them. I mean, it's an absurdity. How can you possibly destroy terrorists by bombing them? But it creates greater chaos. It helps to recruit more terrorists into the organization. It makes life even more problematic for the Kurds.
And George, it's good for TV. It's good for TV too, isn't it? Okay, you get all these pictures. I don't know where'd they get all those Humvees. I really want to know that. There, where did they get all those Humvees? Okay, Patrick. Let me go to Patrick right here.
Yes.
You know, Patrick. You know, George brings up a really good point here, is how other countries, other parts of the world are really coming together. And this narrative that comes out of the West is that Russia's isolated, that China will be isolated, that they will contain it. It shows the weakness of the West because they don't want to engage.
Yes, I mean, you know, subliminally, the West is holding the sword of Damocles over the rest of the world in terms of the threat of overwhelming military force. And I'm afraid that ship has already sailed. Yep. You know, you could look at from the minute the A-bomb was dropped on Japan, the age of nation versus nation or military versus military is over. Yep. And then we went through the humanitarian war phase. That has spent itself with Libya, and Iraq was on a humanitarian basis, which, you know, they justified that war with WMDs and Saddam gassing the Kurds and so forth. So that was basically under that humanitarian banner. That's all spent itself now. So the only thing left is proxies, is war by deception, and all these other sort of, you know, things that are going on in the minutiae.
On that very depressing note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London, Phoenix, and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love it.